From collapsing states, the rise of ISIS, and borders being redrawn, the Middle East seems more volatile than ever and is facing some of its toughest challenges in a century. Will it get worse before it gets better? And will the United States and other non-regional players become more involved in attempting to find solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems? A panel of experts tackle those questions and more during a Wilson Center discussion of the year ahead for the region. That's the focus of this edition of Rewind.
For years, we've talked about the idea of failed states in the region, and I think we are at that point today that we can actually begin talking about a failed region. The main threat is from the array of Islamic extremists who've stolen the show, again, both physically and politically, in places where attempts at peaceful dissent and political change were disintegrated into conflict. ISIS is literally beginning to change the borders. This is a tweet, one of my favorite ones of the day, that ISIS literally bulldozed through the border and began to create a whole new political entity and a new political space. This is the territory it now holds. It's about the size of Indiana. Today, there are 18,000 foreign fighters fighting with ISIS and Nusra. At least a third of the forces of ISIS are foreign fighters. And that number is almost certain to grow significantly this year.
About 2 weeks ago, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani made a speech at an economic conference which rightly attracted a lot of commentary. He said that negotiations at the international level are not about upholding high principles and ideals, but about protecting state interests. I should point out that in earlier speeches, Rouhani also said that morals cannot be imposed by the whip of the lash. He called for less control by the security agencies on university campuses and more open access by Iranians to the internet. A second major problem facing Iran's decision makers relates to the economy. I don't have to go into detail on the crippling effect that the US and UN imposed sanctions have had on the Iranian economy.
So the question that arises most obviously right now is, with the collapse of oil prices, what happens to these countries? The collapse has obviously brought immediate problems. There was a tremendous drop in the value of stock exchanges all across the Gulf, which actually hurts a lot of ordinary citizens. And there's obvious worry about this. Another question that arises is why did Saudi Arabia and its close allies, we're talking about Kuwait, Qatar now, not always, but certainly in oil policy lately, the United Arab Emirates, why did they push for this drop in oil prices? Because it is true that they actually allowed this to happen and perhaps forced the drop in oil prices. Certainly didn't cooperate with other countries in OPEC to support the oil price. I think what really worries people like the Saudis is to see large industry, the whole sort of production cycle of global industry, particularly the car industry, switch away from fossil fuels to something else. That's what really worries them. So they want to make sure the price of oil is somewhere that keeps people addicted to gasoline for as long as possible. So I think that's really the underlying question.
Marina, you talked about Egypt, looking at Egypt. Could you talk a little bit about the U.S. looking at Egypt? It seems the U.S. hasn't figured out what's going on, what's it's going to do. There's differences between the administration and the legislature. There's differences within the administration. There's differences between DOD and state. Could you give us your views on what's going on?
I think the U.S. is looking at Egypt from the point of, in terms of its geostrategic interests, and then Egypt is a country with which it wants to maintain good relations. It's still a stable country. The problem for the United States, and that's where the divisions come in, is that the Egyptian government is not doing a terribly good job at this point of looking presentable enough, very frankly, so that it is not an embarrassment for the United States to be seen as supporting the regime. I mean, if Egypt, I think the real hesitation, the reason why there are conflicts that there at time within the administration is the human rights policy of this regime, that if it just took some steps to moderate its stance, then I think the divisions within the United States, within the administration would probably disappear.
I mean, I think that the United States, first of all, has never had less influence in the Middle East since it became a superpower than it does today. I think the options facing it are, given what happened in Iraq and all the public opinion polls that show the U.S. is, I think there's one recently that showed, and I may not phrase it right, that 80% of the people in the region hate ISIS, but 73% of them hate the United States. Frankly, we don't know how to create an alternative. We're great at waging war, but we don't know how to make peace. We don't know, and we're seen as imposing. And the Iraq experiment only showed that we failed. We don't know how to do it. We may have learned some lessons, but I think that we still haven't learned enough to be able to figure out what will work. There's no question that we want to stand up to ISIS, but how to do that and how to help the people in the region themselves do it, which is really the only way it'll work.
For more information, visit wilsoncenter.org. Click the Programs tab to find additional resources from the Wilson Center's Middle East program.